Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's discussion of a new book just published by Princeton University Press entitled Philanthropy in America, written by University of Virginia Commonwealth professor Olivier Zunz, and it is pronounced Zunz. I checked. From now on, it will be strictly Olivier, as you can imagine.
That's good.
A special welcome to our audience viewing remotely over Ustream. Great to have you, but unhappily for you, you cannot take advantage of our one-time only offer today. We're selling Philanthropy in America in the back of the room, normally at $29.99 value, today only $20. So those of you who showed up, you can take advantage of that special price. Before continuing, I want to do our customary preview of coming attractions. Customary, that is, when we actually manage to plan something a full month in advance. Please mark your calendars for December 6th, when we will be co-hosting a panel with Alliance Magazine to discuss various themes introduced by their September issue entitled Living with the Gates Foundation. We're still pulling the panel together, but be assured that you will hear more open and honest conversation about the Gates Foundation in those 2 hours than you will hear in 2 years of foundation meetings otherwise. Now for today's panel. Professor Zunz closes his wonderful new history of American philanthropy with this observation. Philanthropy is deeply entrenched in the American political economy because it draws on values that Americans claim for themselves in otherwise compartmentalized parts of their lives. A commitment to profit-making, but also to social justice, a respect for individual freedom, and a strong sense of community. The routine of philanthropy depends on the exercise of skills in business, organization, law, and outreach, skills that many Americans train for and in which they excel. An account of philanthropy that points us toward such a variety of American virtues and skills demands for its full appreciation a panel of discussants with an equally impressive array of professional backgrounds and points of view, and I think we've assembled that panel for you this afternoon. Following the opening procession by Olivier, we'll hear from Ellen Cunliffe-Lageman of Bard College, author and editor of some of the leading volumes of history in this field of philanthropy. Then Michael Edwards, a senior fellow at Demos in New York, and editor of the Oxford Handbook of Civil Society, and he's a very good editor, I have to say. I was a contributor to that volume, and he only gave me a modicum of grief about the fact that I was probably a year overdue in my contribution. And finally, John Tyler, who's general counsel at the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City and co-author of a philanthropy roundtable volume entitled How Public is Private Philanthropy. So, Olivier, please. You can either speak from there or speak from here. It's up to you.
Well, we follow your footsteps. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here. I'm very curious to, of course, hear what the panelists and the audience will say. I know they're going to challenge me, and that's going to be fun. I like that. I thought I should tell you briefly why I wrote this book on American philanthropy. Of course, I'm an American. I'm a historian of the United States, and even though I was born in France and raised there, but I spent my life teaching American history at UVA. And but I thought I should tell you why I chose this kind of weird topic in a way, because there are very few histories of American philanthropy. It's not on the historian's radar screen for some reason. But in the you know how one book emerged from another. In the 90s, I published a book on the American century called "Why the American Century?" ? The book was an attempt to answering the question. And in this book on the American century, I've built an argument about America's ascent to world power early in the 20th century, and the thought that really you should think of America's ascent to world power, not just because of the collapse of old Europe during the First World War, even though that was certainly a good reason, but also because of the sort of large domestic transformation of this country at the time, and especially the creation of a science-based economy and the reorganization of knowledge in research universities and the like. And in building this argument, I was really struck, it was new to me, by the role philanthropy played in the creation of these research universities and this science-based economy and the labs and engineering and the science. And really long before there was a National Science Foundation or a National Institute of Health and all of the others, there was the Rockefeller Foundation that funded physics and in this country and worldwide. And I was very intrigued by this. It was not so much, there's little of it in the history books, and you could understand why. In some ways, you want to talk about the inventions and the networks rather than the funders. But there was something important. I realized there was something deeper there, and that I had only scratched the surface, and that philanthropy, the foundation that funded science was only a small part of it, that philanthropy was a huge topic, and historians hadn't really gotten into it. Not just the funding of science and education I was talking about in this book, but by and large, the private funding of affairs of state. I mean, if you want to think of it that way, the private funding of affairs of state. And not just money is coming from the rich, but also the nickel and dimes coming from the many. Because, of course, if philanthropy was to be, would be the exclusive province of the rich, then it wouldn't be very democratic. And I was interested in figuring out how philanthropy was became a national value, how widespread it was, how deep in the population it could go, and what was its contribution to democratic practice, if that was the case or not. So I conceived of this topic not just as looking at big money, philanthropy, large gifts, wealthy people returning some of their profits and the kind of the Carnegie model, but also the coming of mass philanthropy, and then the combination of the two into a non-profit sector that is largely the outcome of the encounter between philanthropy and the state. As I look more, I found plenty of specialized literature of excellent quality, but very few or no synthetic treatment. Certainly none since Robert Brebner's book on American philanthropy that he published in 1960. That was a half century ago. And with the last chapter revised in 1988, like 15-page edition. A book published in the old Dan Burstein series at Chicago, History of Civilization in 1960. And I figured, well, it doesn't happen very often in the life of a historian to find a big topic that has been left out. I mean, it just doesn't happen very often. And I felt pretty lucky that there was one, in a way, was waiting for a new treatment. So my biggest job then was just to find a story, to find a narrative structure for it. Because much of the topic is so amorphous, if you think of it. I had to sort of free myself from two constraints. The first was the sort of the ways in which the literature is organized, and you can understand why it's important enough, but it's like philanthropy and medicine, and philanthropy and the arts, and philanthropy and higher education, philanthropy and preschool education, and philanthropy and this, and philanthropy and that, and it's of course obviously extremely significant to study each subfield. But in some ways, it's always the same story. Somebody gets inspired, makes a gift, institutionalizes the gift, the inspiration, the giving, the organization, and you can, and any one of us can spend several lifetimes rewriting that same story over and over again in different fields. Moreover, as I mentioned briefly, it's hard to attribute the credit to the funder if it's a scientific discovery. If then you want to credit the scientist, if there are other circumstances. So what is the exact place of philanthropy in this? And except that it generates a network and a structure, it's hard to know. The second trap, I think I try to avoid falling in, was the institutional trap. Okay, well, the topic is too big. I need to look at foundations, or I need to look at public charities, or I need to look at this sector or that sector. And I figured, well, I've written a book on the American century, so I should be able to write a book on philanthropy without having to divide it up into all these different sectors, even though many friends and colleagues told me that they had to narrow down the topic to survive it and survive the process. And I know they were well intended, they did this for my own good. But instead of narrowing it, I just made it larger. That is to say, I said, okay, I want to understand the role of philanthropy in American history. Or as the publicist at Princeton University Press put it nicely for me, I want to give philanthropy the history it deserves. It's a very big thing. The budget of the nonprofit sector is bigger than the Pentagon. There's 12% of the statistics, depend on how you count, of course, of employment in it. I mean, it just is a huge field of the American economy, and it's part of the American psyche, and so it needs to be, you need to think big. And I found some important lines of inquiry that I think inform the history. I start in the late 19th century because this is when there was a very significant change in the scale of giving, with the making of very large fortunes. And also in the general rise in income in the population, ever since they discovered gold in Alaska, and they started printing more money. The rise of income and made it possible to devote surplus to giving. So there was a very large change in scale in both big money and modest philanthropy, and a silent legal revolution that made it possible to enlarge, not only to change the scale of philanthropy, but to enlarge its scope. Much philanthropy over the ages was, still now actually, is largely done through bequest. Bequest, you know, heirs always look forward to becoming rich, and then when they don't, they get upset, so they go to court to recover the fortune. And over the ages, if the gifts were not very narrowly, specifically designated with a specific use and so on and so forth, heirs would usually win. In this country, in the late 19th and early 20th century, we went in a generation from giving to the local orphanage, or giving to sailors' widows, or whatever you want, to giving for the good of mankind. And that is a pretty impressive transformation. The Rockefeller Foundation was denied the British Internal Inland Revenue Service. I think that's how it's called, the Inland Revenue Service. The British Inland Revenue Service denied a tax exemption to the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s on returns on investments on the basis that the good of mankind was not a charitable category in England. So I think American philanthropy had found its unique way there. I follow throughout the book the legal issues, the philanthropy and the law, and philanthropy and politics. It seems to me that's a big part of what I say, is that you cannot give for the good of mankind if you stay above the fray. It just doesn't work out that way. And so by law, you're supposed to stay above the fray if you're going to get a tax exemption. So how do you work this out? How do you play this game? What do you call education? What do you call politics? How can you at the same time build a Negro school in the 1930s but be forbidden from desegregating it 15 years later? And so that's very much a dynamic throughout the whole book. I also try to, following the lead of a great historian by the name of Merle Curley, follow philanthropy in the Pax Americana, philanthropy as an addendum to the Cold War, as also a reaction against the Cold War, and the ways in which philanthropists have become, in a sense, private diplomats. Now, throughout the book, I try to address the issue of motivation as much as I can in giving. And here, Tocqueville was a guide for me. I've been a Tocqueville scholar most of my life, and Tocqueville helped me very much. Not so much the Tocqueville's understanding of association and civil society, which is best known, but basically his theory of self-interest properly understood. So what does he mean? What did Tocqueville mean by this? I suppose if you're going to give money away, it's probably better if you do it and your motives are pure. But most of the time they aren't, or they are not pure enough. You do it because you also find your interest in it, your self-interest in it. And I think it is fine. That is to say, as Tocqueville pointed out, as a commodity in society, self-interest comes in much greater supply than virtue. So I guess if you can turn it into something that's in the public interest, well, go for it. And much of the history of philanthropy lies in this. That is to say, it's okay to give and to find your interest in it, provided others do too. And especially if you're going to tolerate a large level of inequality in society, and then it's yet another reason for it. Now, I don't want to talk very long, so I'm going to finish here because I want to hear the distinguished panelists and the audience reaction, because I'm really genuinely interested in this. Now, as a historian, I love it every time I can feel a real life story behind an old forgotten fact that I dig up somewhere in the sources. And it has happened time and again as I was writing this book. Like, for example, when my friend and colleague Julian Bond, the former chair of the NAACP, told me about the Rosenwald School his father helped build in Louisiana in the 1930s. As we were having a casual conversation about what I was working on. And all of a sudden, this whole movement took a different meaning for me. But the best story I think I have here is when the copy editor who worked on the book for reviewed the manuscript for the press called me up because she wanted to discuss page 147, and all of a sudden I was wondering what was the great stylistic mistake I'd made on page 147 that justified this urgent conversation. And she wanted to talk about the grant that the Ford Foundation given to Reinhold Libre in 1951 to relocate professionals from European refugee camps after the war to this country. And guess what? That's when her parents came into the country. And that's why she was, so many years later, copied it in this book. And meanwhile had lived their whole life in this country. And I told her, well, you know, you made my day. Well, so do you, so thank you for coming here today.
I was glad to hear that Olivier's book is for sale back there. You should run and get it for $20. That's a bargain. It's a wonderfully readable, very smart historical account of philanthropy that I think is particularly masterful because Olivier focuses both on the big donor, the major foundations like Rockefeller, Ford, more recently Olin, Gates, and so on, and what he calls mass philanthropy, the popular campaigns to fight TB, to support war efforts, to eradicate polio, and so on. The centerpiece of his argument, as he has said, is that it is the combination of the two. On the one hand, big money philanthropy, and on the other hand, what he calls people's philanthropy, that gives philanthropy a central place in modern American life. Without ever losing the narrative thread that takes him from the 19th century pretty much down to the present, Olivier has deftly explained both the organizational innovations that made big money possible. He manages to discuss the tax code in ways that even people like me understand. And at the same time, he also discusses the culture of shared responsibility and investing in the community that led middle and working class families to save their pennies and to contribute small funds to organizations like the Red Cross. When he gets to the modern era, beginning in the 1960s, Olivier carefully steps over debates between the right and the left about big government, small government, and so on, in order to maintain his focus on the organizational and cultural changes that have continued to sustain philanthropy down to this day. He delineates two quite different, really opposing efforts to reform philanthropy that emerged in the 1960s and thereafter. First, the ideas and activities of pluralists like John Gardner, who wanted to ensure a balanced partnership between public or governmental actions and those of the independent or third or nonprofit sector. And on the other side, the conservatives, like Lewis Powell, who did not want voluntary organizations and traditional American values compromised by government activity. He concludes, which is an interesting interpretation, I think, that it was in the contest between these two factions that we arrived at two crucial points of agreement. First, that religious institutions could be involved in the distribution of government-supported social services. And secondly, that nonprofit organizations could engage in activities that would once have been defined as lobbying. The result of achieving these agreements, Olivier believes, is that the nonprofit sector is now the institutional voice of American civil society. Well, his book is comprehensive, it is fair, it is judicious, and it strikes me on balance as more favorable than troubled about the way philanthropy has evolved in this country. So, since I assume my role in part is to play devil's advocate, I would like to turn the table and raise some questions from the more troubled, less favorable side of the ledger. More specifically, I would like to raise three very broad questions about the impact of philanthropy on the American polity as it has evolved over the last, say, 100 years. It would be hard to argue that the United States would have been better off if tax laws had not evolved so as to allow people of wealth to leave most of their riches to causes in which they are interested as opposed to their immediate family heirs. It was really that tax decision that enabled the creation of foundations. But would we have been even better off if we had more severely restricted the accumulation of wealth by both individuals and corporations, which most likely would have resulted in less philanthropy? Certainly the people in the tents outside, wherever the square is in relation to this room, seem to be suggesting that today. But way back in 1787, in the 10th Federalist paper, James Madison observed that the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property, and that it is the principal task of modern legislation to address these inequities. Because wealth is power today, as it has been throughout history, one must wonder how far wealth, and therefore power, can be unequal if we are to sustain a thriving democracy. As that pertains to philanthropy, one must wonder whether and how philanthropy has made it acceptable to countenance larger discrepancies in wealth than are really in the public good. Has the intermingling of altruism and wealth, as well as a willingness to see philanthropy as a social investment, undermined recognition that the initiative and entrepreneurship encouraged by capitalism must be balanced with protections for public goods ranging from equality among citizens to the condition of the natural environment? So the first question I would pose is, has philanthropy unwittingly contributed to the rationalization of ever-increasing inequality of wealth in this country, and with that, to less rather than more democracy? The second question can be put in a different way that is more directly relevant to what Olivier calls popular philanthropy. Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House, used to argue, and I'm quoting, "We have learned to say that the good must be extended to all of society before it can be held secure by any one person or class. But we have not yet learned to add that unless all people and all classes contribute to the good, we cannot even be sure that it is worth having." Following that logic, I would ask, is it possible for one donor or one board of trustees or the professional managers of the Red Cross and similar organizations to define programs that can truly benefit people who are not asked to participate in the design of those programs? Concerns about wider participation in social programs, of course, led to efforts to achieve what was called maximum feasible participation during the war on poverty in the Great Society. And maximum feasible participation of community representatives created all sorts of problems. But the question is, was the impulse right? Do we need to find more effective strategies to broaden efforts to define public goods? In thinking about that, I find it useful to remember, or at least to think about what I think is a fact, that despite the social media that we have today, Twitter and Facebook and all of them, we don't really have effective technologies for facilitating intelligent communication among large groups of people. And that's essential to the maintenance, I think, of healthy communities. Town meetings were invented in the 17th century, and we need to go beyond them as forums, actual and even metaphorical, in which citizens deliberate their way to consensus. So my second question is, what about matters of participation and process? Have the good deeds of philanthropy, and I don't question those, prevented us from worrying about the process that is involved in philanthropic decision-making? Can privately formulated initiatives really be for the public good? And that brings me to my third and final question. In recent years, as Olivier points out, the boundaries between different sectors, notably the public or governmental and nonprofit sectors, have become more and more blurred. Does that blurring advantage the wealthy and disadvantage everyone else? Is that blurring beneficial for the American polity as a whole? Throughout the 20th century, smart philanthropists have realized that by investing in the development and dissemination of expertise, they can help shape public opinion and public policy. That was true even before somewhat artificial lines between public education and advocacy were left behind. While it is true that conservatives seem to have pursued this strategy more prominently and successfully than liberals since about 1980, in doing so, they were really taking their cue from a playbook invented by liberals way back in the early 20th century, when think tanks like the Brookings Institution were first established. What I have called in writing I've done the politics of knowledge has been played in and through philanthropic investments in new fields of knowledge, for example, law and economy, and new institutions for generating policy-relevant knowledge, especially think tanks, but also university research centers, for well over 100 years. In light of that history, one must ask, I think, whether the politics of knowledge has actually eclipsed electoral politics in the United States. And if that is the case, what does that suggest about the equal rights that are meant to exist among citizens? The politics of knowledge is one deeply shaped by foundations, by philanthropy, whereas electoral politics, at least theoretically, is accessible to all citizens who exercise the franchise. Leave aside the politics of knowledge. The blurring of sectors is also a result of philanthropists trying to shape public institutions quite directly. I wish I could be here for the conversation about the Gates Foundation. Olivier talks about the role Gates has played in international public health campaigns and so on. But they also have been deeply involved in public education. Some years ago, for example, they launched a small schools initiative, which was quite effective in encouraging the transformation of large schools into small schools. There are all sorts of questions one can raise about the educational issues, but the question I want to ask is, what are the pros and cons of having philanthropic foundations exercise such profound influence over such a vital domain of public life? I'm not as wealthy as Bill Gates, nowhere near. I cannot leverage my ideas about public education as effectively as he can. Is that fair? Is that wise? Does it make sense in a democracy where it may be important to have citizens come together to discuss how they want their children educated? In conclusion, let me just reiterate that I am raising these more troubling questions because I think Olivier has made a very strong case for the positive contributions that philanthropy has made to American society. But we live in very troubling times, I think, when the divisions among us seem to have trumped our capacities to talk, listen, and work across differences, when our government seems dysfunctional in all sorts of ways. So in the midst of these troubling times, it seems to me important not only to appreciate the positive contributions philanthropy has made, but also to ponder whether and how, inadvertently and otherwise, it has been implicated in the problems we face currently. Thank you.
Well,
I have to say, I enjoyed this book enormously. It's actually a pleasure, given most of what I read about philanthropy, to read something which is intelligent and reflective and jargon-free and relatively balanced, I think. It's a book that deploys all the skills you would expect of a historian to delve much more deeply than we usually allow for ourselves into the issues that we face in our field. And it's definitely a book that should be on the desk of every donor and program officer and non-profit leader and policy maker. And in contrast to most of what passes for literature about philanthropy, which usually means crunching vast amounts of numbers on giving or writing superficial reports that do little more than praise the innovation of their paymasters, Olivier's book focuses on the broader questions, the deeper questions, the real questions of philanthropy's contribution to society, its relationship to government and the public interest, and how different forms of giving intertwine to either enlarge or restrict democracy and freedom over time. In other words, he's focusing on what you might think of as the political economy of philanthropy in the classical sense of that phrase. And I think that's exactly right. That's what we need more than anything else. He has a great grasp of detail, but manages to preserve somewhat miraculously a coherent storyline over about 200 years and 300 pages. His approach is nuanced, it's balanced, there are very few axes to grind, maybe except on donor intent and foundation perpetuity, where I think the position is just too rigid. And he writes in a very clear and engaging style. And of course, parts of this story have been told already by others, but rarely have they been brought together in one place like this, so that the reader can judge the evolution of philanthropy in the round from the early 19th century right up to the present day. And there are literally hundreds of juicy historical tidbits in these pages, if that's what you want. If you want a sort of resource book for Trivial Pursuit Philanthropy Edition, then this is the book for you. Many were new to me and they're fascinating. I just chose two. Attorney General George Wickenham, this is in 1910, railing against the new foundations of Rockefeller and others as, quote, entirely inconsistent with the public interest. Where have I heard that before? 100 years later. Or the origins of the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy, which I never realized emerged from a group of dissenters from the Filer Commission report in 1975. So there's a huge amount of that sort of juicy detail, I won't say gossip, but detail to delve into. But more importantly, I think the book tries to pull out and follow a number of common threads that are instantly recognizable in today's debates about philanthropy, but are in fact deeply rooted in the historical record. The desire for greater impact, for example, concerns over the influence of the wealthy that Ellen has raised over public policy concerns, the merits and demerits of supposedly scientific approaches to philanthropy, and the ability of foundations to support social movements and other radical actions when they're constrained by a regulatory framework that restricts the scope of their activities. I think that's a very important point because we look to historians not just for their analysis of patterns from the past, but also for their guidance in helping us to deal with similar issues in the present. Not obviously as narrow policy analysts, you're not expecting detailed policy recommendations for a book like this, but as people who are trained to shed light on contemporary dilemmas from the perspective of human experience that's synthesized over the longer term of any one particular life or generation or period of time. And on that score, I have to say that I found Olivier's book less convincing. That's partly because he casts his net so widely, defining philanthropy as pretty much everything, from church-based giving to international development NGOs like CARE, to the Gates Foundation, to the civil rights movement, including giving of every ideological stripe or style, every sector, and across radically different political contexts, as attitudes in government particularly have shifted over time. And it will be surprising if you could somehow shoehorn all of that stuff into a common historical pattern. And therefore, inevitably, I think some of the chapters, especially those that focus on the last 30 years or so, feel to me a little superficial. They move too quickly to a positive consensus while ignoring the critical literature that's already grown up around, for example, the expansion of NGOs overseas, or the role of foundations in the decline of civil society in the United States since the end of World War II, as they pull back from grassroots and other membership associations in favor of spending on universities and advocacy groups and large service-providing non-profits. Olivier claims that there has been a historical convergence between what he calls the mass philanthropy of ordinary people and the big money philanthropy of foundations, but I'm not so sure that's true. There's also a hint of exceptionalism, I think, in the book's belief that American philanthropic models have been successfully exported to other countries, including those in the post-communist world, which Olivier cites as a major success. But sadly, we know that civil societies there are exceptionally weak, despite the role that activists played prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, despite the largesse of Soros and Ford and others. And he's definitely wearing some extremely rosy-tinted spectacles when he gets to the last chapter of the book, which hails the example of the Gates Foundation as a model for the future. There may be something inevitable here, that the tools and perspectives of the historian are less useful as the narrative approaches the present day. Maybe that's true. Gates is praised as the most pragmatic of foundations, which will surprise those at the receiving end of what is clearly a pro-market approach to public education here or food security in Africa. There's no acknowledgement or assessment of the accountability deficits that face Gates and other large foundations, or the power of technocratic elites that increasingly dominate this field, or the downside of the kind of business-oriented philanthropy that is the flavour of the day. Despite the fact, and here's my disappointment, that Olivier does analyse those issues earlier in time, in previous episodes of perceived foundation overreach in the 1930s and the 1960s. So I guess I wanted more of a connection between past, present and future on these big questions, including the biggest question of all, which Olivier summarises in his conclusion, which is this: is philanthropy an effective bridge between capitalism and community, as he puts it? So it's a beautiful phrase. Can philanthropy be a successful bridge between capitalism and community, in a sense what we're all striving to achieve? Is America actually better off as a result of its greater reliance on private solutions and the noblesse oblige of the wealthy than societies that have placed more faith in government and what one might call unsubsidized, which means free and independent citizen civic action? Action, in other words, that is not dependent on government largesse or foundation dollars. I'm not so sure that his answer to that question is correct. The United States today has the highest levels of inequality since records began. It sits far below the welfare state economies of Northern Europe on the Legatum Global Prosperity Index. It's dropped from 4th position to 23rd on this year's United Nations Human Development Index, and it scores lower than Gabon and Equatorial Guinea on the Global Peace Index that is published by The Economist a few months ago, which actually takes some doing to be below those two countries. During the same period, of course, more and more wealth has been produced, philanthropy has continued to expand, new foundations are launched every day. So you would think there is something missing from this picture. At the very least, those trends place a question mark, and I would say a pretty big question mark, over the long-term effectiveness of the model Olivier rates so highly. In his final sentence, he writes, quote, that if there is a lesson from the history I have told, it is that philanthropy enlarges democracy when it is an activity in which the many participate. I think that's absolutely true. But if, and this is me speaking, the many are participating less and less against the background of mounting insecurity and social division, then what does that have to say about the political economy of philanthropy in America and beyond? That's surely the ultimate question for historians to ponder. So my advice is to buy and read and use this book for the rich insights it contains about the past, but to wait for the second edition in 25 years' time if you want more rigorous reflections on philanthropy in the present. And let's hope Olivier is still around to write it. Thanks.
I want to begin by thanking Bill and Kristen and the Bradley Center for hosting this panel, another in a long continuing line of successfully engaging in dialogue. And I appreciate the center and its work and how it does that. I also want to thank Professor Zunz for writing what is an interesting and easy to read book. It gives a nice summary of many of the activities of philanthropy over the years. It's not exhaustive, but it does do a nice job of hitting the highlights. I particularly appreciate how the examples tie into the characteristics of philanthropy that are so important and have been so important over the decades to American society and increasingly the world. Characteristics related to innovation, risk-taking, flexibility, and other things that foundations, because of how American society has treated them and continues to treat them, allow philanthropy to contribute to society. As others have said, this is not a normal history book. It doesn't start with a beginning and work towards an end in a chronological order, although it sort of does that. It's got a wonderful thread through it about things related to philanthropy's interaction with society, interaction with policy dynamic. So it's not merely a recitation. It's not merely a chronological presentation. It is, in fact, a presentation in context. And it's both a context of the policy dialogue and the social interaction, and also then, as others have mentioned, not just big philanthropy, but mass philanthropy as well. Three other things that I like about the book. One, early on in the book, Professor Zunz discusses the grand vision of donors and how important that was to creating what we know as American philanthropy today. First, a grand vision in making the money that could then be dedicated to charitable purposes, and then the grand vision for dedicating that money to the broader purposes of the good of humankind. And I think that Professor Zunz's treatment of that development, particularly the development of the law, and as a lawyer, I like reading about developments of the law. As a lawyer, I appreciate that it's not for lawyers to read. It is very readable for non-lawyers. There's no legalese. It's actually, I think, a compelling story and a compelling presentation of it. I do like how, and have not seen this before, where there's the evolution of the policy dialogue and engagement between philanthropy and government, and how it has evolved and changed, and sometimes gone backwards. I mean backwards in time, not necessarily backwards in policy or value, from Civil War Reconstruction era through World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, into the Civil Rights Movement, and through today. The tensions between philanthropy and government, how government has used philanthropy and at certain times, and how government has not used philanthropy and in fact has distanced itself from philanthropy, which again ties into, in some ways, some of the characteristics about philanthropy's flexibility. One other thing I found particularly interesting was Professor Zunz's treatment of the 1969 Tax Act. The normal narrative is that the Tax Act came about based on a series of commissions and hearings and arguments about abuse in particularly foundations, and that the act was intended or resulted in regulation, if you will, to prevent and correct those abuses. Well, and Professor Zunz does talk about that, but he adds a different perspective and what I think is a new narrative, which is the segregationist motivations of some in Congress to go after the foundations that were in fact supporting and advocating and contributing to the advancement of the civil rights movement. And with that narrative, it kind of puts the Tax Act in a different context, in a different light. Makes me wonder how much reliance at the time we should have put into accountability to the Tax Act as essentially a mechanism of revenge. But it also points out the vulnerability of philanthropy generally to regulation driven not by what's necessarily maybe in the best interests of the sector, the best interests of society, but based on the purely political and in some cases personal motivations, as Professor Zunz points out with the '69 Act and the segregationists in Congress. There are a few things that I'd like to, that in reading the book, raised questions for me, though. One of them was the extent to which that Professor Zunz talks about big philanthropy and mass philanthropy. And I think he talks about both generally very well. But he leaves out the big middle. And when you look at the numbers of foundations, huge numbers of them are small, mid-sized, and many of them family foundations. And there's no mention of the contributions of these the middle ground, the middle area of their contributions to philanthropy, many of which are extremely important to local initiatives and strengthening local communities. The mention that is made of them is in related to the Tax Act, in some ways an indictment of this large middle ground of philanthropy as tools for tax evasion and nothing else. And I think that misses the important contributions of a big segment of philanthropy. Another question that I had that came to me while reading the book was what seemed to be, at a certain point, there begins a narrative around juxtaposing liberal progressive philanthropy with conservative philanthropy, such that the language, the examples, we've got liberal progressive foundations being innovative, advancing society, taking risks. We've got conservative foundations that are characterized as engineering results, evading tax laws. And the juxtaposition, I'm not sure what's to be gained from that. Another example, in talking about J. Howard Pew, in talking about the Pew Trust's conversion from a private foundation to a public charity, the book talks about the Pew Trust, quote, had actually distanced itself from its conservative origins and become a pluralistic foundation. I always viewed pluralism as welcoming from across the perspective, not merely the side of the perspective that is not conservative. So I'm curious why carving out conservative from the benefits of pluralism, which I think is one of the most important characteristics of the philanthropic sector and one of its most important contributions to our society, is the broad range of views and perspectives and missions and purposes. More generally, how the book approaches conservative contributions seems to be less recognizing that there are contributions and more suggesting that what conservative foundations are interested in is either religion for its own sake, social services for the sake of religion. So again, it's all tied into religion without any underlying value to society. So it's religion-based, or targeted to undoing that which the liberal or progressive movement has done. And I'm not convinced that's a reasonable or fair definition of conservative foundations or conservatism or the conservative movement. And I think that it does a disservice to philanthropy writ large to narrowly treat the conservative movement that way. He provides excellent examples and stories about J. Howard Pew's early support for Billy Graham. And it's, I think, a compelling narrative that he provides, but it seems to me it's to make the point that conservatives are interested in religion, and not just religion, but Christianity in particular. He leaves out any mention of the Olin Foundation. To me, one of the most compelling contributions of philanthropy in the last several decades, whether you agree with it or not, the effectiveness of the law and economics movement has been extraordinary. How it has entered society and has influenced thinking and encouraged debate and thinking has been extraordinary. And without any mention of that initiative, I think it's shortchanging what might be considered conservative advances. And I'm not sure I understand where the lines of distinction come from, and I'm not sure what benefit is to be gained from them. I think there's something to be lost because of what I view as unexplained, unreasoned distinctions. On the scope of capitalism, Professor Zunz, early on in the book, extols the virtues of capitalism as a means for making the money that's necessary to be given away. Without the money to be given away for humankind, there is no, then, money to be given away for humankind. The book in the later chapters also talks about international activities where the liberal progressive foundations and conservative foundations are working together internationally to export, and I think Michael talked about it, thank you, talked about the efforts to export democracy, capitalism, free markets, and some good discussion of those interactions. But as it relates to what happens in the middle, the early approaches to philanthropy's intersection with capitalism and the more recent, there's no discussion in the middle. And there are some who argue that actually philanthropy or segments of philanthropy, the arguments have been made, actually undermine capitalism and undermine the capitalist system that becomes the root for the funds to be contributed to for the good of mankind in any event. I'd like to ask a question. How many of you came here in a car? Anyone? How many of you have a car? Okay. How many of you have cell phones? That's why I thought it looks pretty unanimous. I want to suggest to you, and this is actually more a response to Ellen, I want to suggest to you that the automobile revolutionized transportation, revolutionized our ability to collectively engage. And yet again, in exponential ways, the cell phone has done precisely the same. In both instances, they are privately formed initiatives that have served the public good and have served it ubiquitously. With that, I want to conclude by saying there's a lot to like and respect about Professor Zunz's book. I would suggest care in treating it as exhaustive or definitive, because it seems that some parts of the book are more so history with an agenda as opposed to history for history's sake.
Well, thank you all very much. As is my custom, I'm going to poke and prod the anthill a little bit here. Can't resist. Going to Professor Lagerman's and Michael's critique of your book, I think that if there's a problem with, especially with early progressive, what we now think of as sort of early progressive philanthropy and the early large foundations, they understood themselves, as you suggest, to be operating in the public interest and on behalf of a kind of a democracy. But Professor Lagerman raises the issue, is the politics of knowledge enough to secure a democracy, when in fact the politics of knowledge by its nature mobilizes wealthy people, it mobilizes the experts, it mobilizes the professions, but it doesn't necessarily mobilize the masses. It doesn't necessarily mobilize what we regard as the grassroots. And I think, as I say, I think both Ellen and Michael were getting to that case. what is your reaction to that? Does that lead you to rethink the contribution of philanthropy to democracy, or do we have an answer for that? I trust we have an answer for that.
Well, as I was listening to the various comments, first I want to thank the three of you, because this conversation is charging my energy, of course, as you can imagine. And so maybe I can take a few minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I just hope you hit that particular point. I'm sure you will as you're moving
right.
to that.
I think Ellen. Well, first of all, I want to say this is a work of a historian, whom I am, and as such, I try to take this very large part of the political economy, as you pointed out, and treat it as a unit. It's not a perfect unit. The boundaries are difficult to draw. I completely agree with John when he says the middle ground is sort of not given its full due, largely because, it's not an excuse I'm trying to make here, but it's largely because the information available for this book was very hard to bring together, and much of what I could find out about the middle ground came from such reports as the 1969 tax report and those. I do want, however, to suggest to you that the sections on community foundations, which pervade the book from the beginning 1913 all the way to Eastern Europe, were intended to at least get that middle ground in there, as well as the discussion of the Tax Act. So it's not quite accurate to say that they aren't there, but they are not given the prominence that perhaps they could. Part of the success of this book might be that it might become quickly obsolete if it generates people to do some of the work that I couldn't do in some ways. So my friends were right, just to begin with. Now, one very small point, I do mention the Olin Foundation book.
No, it's mentioning the Olin Foundation, you do, but not their most significant contribution, which is law and economics. That's my criticism.
Yeah, right. And I think it's a very important movement. The publisher asked me when I gave him the manuscript, will philanthropists like this book? And I said, well, it depends. If they look at the index and don't find their name, they may not. Okay. So the second thing I want to say, and this talks to Michael's point about the last couple of chapters. The last two chapters, I found them on the last 30 years the most difficult to write, because it's very hard to, it's very difficult to write history of the present. History has to decide what matters. And we hear journalists every day say that we've made history today on this, that, or the other. How do they know? Okay, only time will tell. And it's very difficult. It's very tricky. Nobody ever thought it was going to be easy, but it's very tricky to write a history that goes from a century and a half ago to the present, and not have a present that is informed by the latest news. And 3 years later, the last three chapters are completely obsolete or irrelevant. So what I try to do in those last chapters is not necessarily to have a definitive judgment on what's going on right now, because I couldn't, but it's at least to have a narrative of it consistent with the previous history that led to that. And I think that's what I tried to achieve there. I also happen to think that your in describing the current state of American decline, which is accurate and troublesome, you're, in a sense, asking too much of philanthropy, which is not the welfare state and was never meant to be. So it seems to me that there is a disjunction between between the characterization you make and the fact that you might be attributing that if the history had been different, if the history of philanthropy had been different, we might not be there. But I don't see the logical connection there.
Okay.
That is, the history of philanthropy might have been very different, and yet we might still be having those problems because there are many other reasons why we're having them.
But you can't have it both ways. You can't argue on the one hand that philanthropy is this rather wonderful creation, which part of America's gift to the world, which implies that it's extremely powerful, and on the other hand that it's not powerful because it can solve the kind of deficit that I just pointed out. So
Well-
the logic goes both ways.
Well, I actually think that you can have it both ways because there are very few things you cannot have both ways. I'm sorry, the answer is too global. That's one point. The second point, you bring me to something I will take issue with both you and Ellen. It's true that I have a positive attitudes towards philanthropy here. First of all, I mean, I had an old friend who was a Russian historian, and he hated everything about Russia. And I kept asking him how he could spend his life writing about something he really hated. And now, I try to, and actually the conversation again with the publisher reminded me of that. I said to him, you know, this is a positive view of philanthropy, and one of the first things that can happen in intellectual or academic circle is to have a positive view of anything. Because, and on the other hand, I stand by it because I think and this will lead me, Ellen, to answering some of your points. I stand by it because I wanted to give a positive view of something that has done a lot more good than not good. In the first place. And second, I do think that I tried systematically to look at the underside of it as well. Just with the, you know, I got a fair amount of money from the Ford Foundation. They were very generous with me in giving me a year's leave and all that to work on this. But I still said this foundation began as a tax dodge, okay, which it did. You know, I mean, I never got anything from the Mellon Foundation, but my painting of Andrew Mellon in this book is not very favorable, even though it was exonerated. I tried to look at the underside of it as much as I could, precisely because I wanted to show that the underside of it is considerable, and yet it may not be in the long run as important as it is. Now, I do believe that there are two more points I want to make. One addressing Ellen's comment and returning to John, and then one more to you. Ellen, you made three comments. The second one was about participation. And frankly, I think your second comment somehow partly at least invalidates the first and the second. I'm going to explain. Participation is the whole game here. That is to say, participation is what motivated me in doing this, in writing this book. That is to say, how people participate in society. It seems to me that often there is a distinction between saying, well, if you give your time and your energy, then it's real participation. But if you give just money, it's not real participation. It's like when American Jews give to Israel, it's checkbook Judaism, but it's not really like the same thing as real participation or whatever. You can do this sort of. I do think that engagement in philanthropy is a way, very important way for many people to participate, and it's not always easy. I mean, maybe for the very wealthy it doesn't cost a lot, but for most of us it does. It does generate some kind of sacrifice. Even if you, and it's certainly there's an investment that's larger than the amount of money that we give, and it's combined with generous volunteer work as well. Those things are, and it seems to me, this is where philanthropy enlarges democracy. Is by participation, by fostering participation in many and in a very diverse way. Now, okay, should we have more equality? And but the real answer, I cannot tell you, neither can you for that matter. But the thing is, yes, philanthropy is a rationalization for inequality. You're absolutely right. But the opposite is the increased state, a larger state, and larger tax system is a rationalization for not giving and not participating. And I've seen this time and again, especially in France, for example, where I grew up, as very wealthy people say, well, it's not my problem. It's taken my money already. And so there's a kind of responsible capitalism that I think philanthropy generates that is the other side of the argument. I think it's, so I'm not sure which is the best of the two, and I think you're right to ask the question. But the answer is that's okay. Yes, you're absolutely right to say that Bill Gates is very powerful. No question about that. And I'm sure, like many very wealthy philanthropists, he enjoys it. Certainly Carnegie did. But remember, who was most important here? Herbert Spencer or Carnegie? I mean, you know, you said that you didn't have the power to compete with Bill, but you do. Of course, you may. Herbert Spencer was, in a sense, perhaps more important. I don't know. But you do not on the same level. It's not equivalent. I mean, the question is right, but the answer is not obvious either. But so it seems to me that if you, I do believe that philanthropy is the engine of civil society today. Now, I may be wrong on this, but that was my motivation. And now, I want to address two more things, 2 more points. When I agree with John that I haven't been as generous as I could be with the conservative movement. It's a fair criticism of the book. I think of myself as a radical of the center, whatever that may mean. But
Only a Frenchman.
but your characterization of my of the fact that I've been more generous with in my judgment with liberal philanthropies, probably mostly because of their role in the civil rights movement, which was the larger role, and the long and the short of it was probably it, and over a very long period of time, and against the odds, that impressed me more. Now, I do have to say that when I read Howard Pugh write in so many words, the source of poverty is sin. The source of poverty is sin, quote unquote. Okay, then I have to think about this. Okay, and that's what he believed in.
What he believed in.
That's what he believed in. Now, but he's not the only one. Now, of course. So, you know, if I'm going to talk about him, talk about that. Now, of course, there has been I do believe that the only reason, I may be wrong again because I was not at the table around the table when this happened, but historians always have to invent things. It's not written in the papers we read, especially business archives. I do believe that the only reason why the Pew Charitable Trust, which became and I agree with you, the word pluralism or pluralistic, I could have used it in a different meaning. I kept the criticism completely. But I do believe that the reason why they went from a foundation to public charity was to have a greater ability to lobby. And they were quite obvious about it. And I think they actually, I think it was kind of a fraud on their part because they are not a public charity. They are 7 funds from different families. And so it was just a matter of semantics. Now, maybe they were right to do so. They were involved in they wanted to do it for their legislation in the environment. They are deep into it. And it was a smart thing to do. But it was a play on words on their part. Now, I pointed it out. No big deal. It's part of the underside of things. That's why I said it's not just a rosy picture. At least not in my mind. But I knew I was going to be accused of that. But I said, fine, I'm a grown-up. I can take it. But I think your point that actually, since I know Chapter 8 had been distributed, I looked at it again this morning, and I made myself that same remark. So maybe I could have been a little more generous with the conservative movement, that is giving them more of a vision and less of a reactive dimension, which is I think what your criticism was, and I accept it. Now, I don't think, Mike, of the Gates Foundation as the great American model of pragmatism, although it's part of the narrative. I agree with you there. Maybe I could have redirected that a little bit. But what impressed me a great deal about their work abroad is that they were trying, it seems to me, in a very interesting, intelligent way, and to connect the global, and the local, the global economy, the generation of global wealth, with work at the very local level. In a sense, bypassing a lot of intermediate states that proved to be corrupt or not channeling the money where it was needed, whether it was to turn African farmers into market farmers or to fight AIDS in India, and that somehow they were experimenting with ways in which you could go from Davos, Switzerland, to the highways of Andhra Pradesh in India, and actually have some results. And I thought that was in the kind of a global world in which we live, an important experiment. Whether it will be history, I agree with you, I can't say. But I just wanted to point that out. So my intent was not to say, oh, Bill Gates is wonderful and look at this wonderful work he's doing. It's America, it's calling itself. It was far from it. It was that movement that I tried to target. Anyway, those I think those are wonderfully important points. I didn't write this book thinking I had the answers to all of it. I knew I took a lot of risk. It hasn't been written in 50 years. So now at least people can go at it and maybe do more. Yeah.
Right. Good. Yeah. Why don't we? We'll continue the conversation here, but let's get some questions in from the audience. We have a terrific audience. Yes, this gentleman right down in front. If you could speak directly, speak directly and clearly into the handheld mics during Q&A.
Hello.
And identify yourself, please.
Testing. I'm Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon. I have a question in lieu of the activity with the Occupy Wall Street in D.C. and the various cities in which they're inhabiting, with a message to the 1%, people who are probably the most of the philanthropists. What would you think that their counterpoint would be about some of the things that they've done that should be promoted rather than be criticized?
In other words, what is the message of the 99% that might be addressed to philanthropy? I see. Okay. What is the, yeah.
Last night I saw in the recent issue of the New Yorker, one of the 1% who said, well, I do as usual, I occupy Wall Street. It was a... I'm sorry, I couldn't resist it. But look, again, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that question. I'm not sure that I'm qualified. One of the points of the book is that philanthropy is a very large activity, and actually a lot of people among the 99% are philanthropists. A big foundation, I mean, foundation money accounts for at most 12% of giving. And early in the 20th century, it was like 6%. So it has grown in the 20th century, but not in early 21st, but not by that much. Even that's doubled perhaps, but still only 12% of giving. And I think every time there has been a survey of these issues, and I mentioned a number of them in my book, modest Americans are more generous than wealthy Americans in terms of proportion of income. So I don't want anybody to think that I mean, people have, the commentators have mentioned this. It was one of the things I wanted to do, is to show the democratization of wealth there and the democratization of giving. And this is why I think it's in addition, not a detraction from democracy. Although I think the question about participation in non-voting forms of democratic activities is an important question. Now, one of the reasons why I have been less generous with part of the conservative movement has been, you know, the literature we read from Irving Kristol and from the New Right and about, you know, that about dependency, about all of these things, and which I have not agreed with, and that, in a sense, explain perhaps the overall tone. I do think that the movement against Wall Street is entirely justified. I've lost a lot of money that in the last few years, like everybody else, in my retirement funds and whatever. So I do think that they have a lot to work. I wrote a book called Making America Corporate, published in 1990, where I believed in industrial capitalism. I think financial capitalism is messed things up. I believe in production. I believe in things we can have in our hands. So here we go.
Other responses. I'm sure we have other thoughts here.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, a lot of this conversation, including this question, for me revolves back to the question of when is concentration useful, when is it legitimate, when is it helpful to democracy and freedom and equality and so on. You know, it's interesting, if we only had mass philanthropy and family philanthropy, what sort of history would Olivier have written? And how different would it have been, or might it have been, from the history that he's actually written? Which to me is much more about concentrated philanthropy. It's about big money philanthropy than it is about mass philanthropy. Because I think there are some situations where you need large concentrations of wealth and power and influence to do stuff, to do things. Take the example of vaccine research and subsidization of drug delivery for HIV, for example. You can't do that in a dispersed democratic way. You have to go full on to solve that problem with large infusions of power, influence, and wealth and resources. That's why that part of the Gates Foundation is very successful. But there are lots of other areas where the opposite principle applies. And one of those areas is transforming the systems that create patterns of poverty and inequality. That's a democratic enterprise because we don't agree with each other on what needs to be done. So I think we need to be clearer with each other on where we think concentrated philanthropy is actually useful and legitimate and where it isn't, and re-regulate ourselves accordingly. Otherwise, because of the way inequality is developing, getting worse and worse year by year in most countries actually, the history of the next 50 years will also be about big money philanthropy, because that's the model that's being copied in large parts of the world. If you go to China, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, India, it's big money philanthropy that is being copied and that is the source of excitement. And there are certain ways in which that could be very useful. There are lots of other ways in which we can't. So I think Occupy Wall Street is an example, in a sense, of mass philanthropy of a kind. That's very true, which we need to encourage. Whether philanthropy has a direct role in that, I'm not so sure. Big money philanthropy, because there isn't any big philanthropic money in Occupy Wall Street, as far as I understand it, and maybe that's a good thing. But I think we've rather had our attention turned, our heads turned by big money philanthropy in a way which is unhealthy for the debate as a whole.
Yeah, Ellen, did you want to get in?
I think the issue of concentration is right on. I mean, I think he's hit it. And in terms of participation, I don't think it's a choice of giving money or time or whatever. I think the question is, how can we widen, for some, how can we widen the circle of people who are involved in designing policy? That, to me, is a crucial aspect of participation. It's not simply sending your check to the Red Cross. It's actually figuring out how the Red Cross ought to be operated. And how do we do that but keep organizations effective? I think that's a huge challenge.
Why don't we hear from our NCRP contingent, and since they have such a prominent role in the book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. My name is Christine Reeves, and I am indeed with the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. And I had a question for Ms. Lagman, Professor Lagman, as well as any others who would like to comment. You had mentioned one of your questions that you posed was talking about how can the people or demographics of people who are the intended beneficiaries truly benefit from philanthropy if they're not involved in the process. And you briefly touched on it just a moment ago. But I was wondering what your thoughts are for what participation is. Is it having grant-making programs that are geared towards advocacy, community organizing, and civic engagement? Is it having diverse staff and board members or community members that actually do the grant-making? Is it foundations or individual funders that see those who they fund as their partners that, while not having the money, do have the capacity to carry out programming, unlike a foundation, unless it's an operating one, as opposed to seeing them as their grant recipients in a more maybe paternalistic viewpoint? And if you could expand on that in terms of not just having that impact, but also making it a more democratic process where the participants don't merely participate, but are much more active in all parts of the process.
Well, if I had a really good answer to that question, I'd write a book called Participation, and I'd get you to run a number of seminars to publicize the book. So I guess what I'm trying to raise is, I think the question you've just asked is the crucial question, because I think there are many, many different ways to participate. And I think having a more diverse representative board and staff and all that is important. I think giving grantees different roles is important. I think all of it is important. But I actually think the problem of how we actualize participation in broader, more democratic ways without losing the efficiency and the effectiveness that comes with more narrower circles of decision making is one of the huge challenges that we face in thinking about how can the social media become resources for all of us. I don't think necessarily having a cell phone is a good thing. I think it depends on how it's used. I mean, too often the media put us all in our little private world. And how do we use those media to address some of these issues of participation? I think that's a hugely important question. And I hate to answer a question with a question, but it's really the best I can do.
And I would add that there's another layer to the question that is also important, and that is, how does the participation come about? Is it something that is voluntarily undertaken and engaged by an individual institution or organization, or is it mandated by government? And I mean, there's a huge spectrum of opinion around those things, and I think that is inextricably tied to the question, which I think is a good one: what is participation?
Why don't we grab a couple more questions? Yeah, you'll have to wait for the microphone right down front here, please, if we could, and then we can go to the back. This gentleman has been waiting. Speak directly and clearly into the handheld.
Practically swallowing it.
Excellent.
You mentioned the democratization of giving. Now, that reminds me, college graduates are expected to pitch into their university just right off the cuff, without any kind of say in how that money gets spent. College administrators pretend that this is a normal thing. I think it's fairly revolutionary, particularly over the last 50 years, but that's me just offering a completely made-up number. I actually don't know if that's normal, but I do wonder if in the course of your research you saw how donor intent might have been stronger, maybe 50 years ago. If there was a period where donor intent was strong and that has actually waned, or do you think that donor intent is stronger now than it was in the past?
On the college graduates, fundraising for Harvard began in the 1600s. As soon as Harvard College was created, they began raising money for it. And so this is the alumni list is one of the oldest invention. These things go back a long way. Ben Franklin invented many things, including the Action grants. Donor intent, I think, Jefferson, where I live, is quoted often, of course, said the earth belongs to the living. And donor intent disappears pretty quickly in philanthropy. It's a good thing, actually. The decision goes to the trustees rather quickly in most instances. Which is, I think, what we've very much seen in the Pew Charitable Trust. I mean, from kind of religious foundation to a center, even left of center, pluralistic in different ways. Foundations. I want to say something real quick on the big money mass connection here. Look, it's absolutely true that the big show catches your attention. I mean, it's just normal, right? So whether it's here or abroad, in what we do here or what we export. But I don't think it's true that it's necessarily the only model being exported. Certainly in the 1990s, when there was all this activity in Eastern Europe, the community foundation was a model that was widely exported, and there's nothing more mass than the community foundation. And the same thing in England actually happened. There's a community foundation movement in England as well. But so this goes back to Cleveland in 1913. So you can class this trajectory. But I agree with you. People talk about the bright stars, but that's not the only model that's exported. The big money, mass money, having clearly different purposes. I'm not sure that's true either. This is what makes this topic so complicated in a way, so amorphous, so difficult. But well, who says it's only big money that can produce the pharmaceutical research for AIDS vaccines or malaria or dengue fever or whatever? clearly, Gates does that quite effectively. So does Clinton by raising big money, because he doesn't have it himself. And he raises big money all around the world because there's been a lot of, not so much because it's the big money model, because there's a lot of big money that's been made to begin with. So again, there's a question of what precedes what. But historically, the American Tuberculosis Society was created before the Rockefeller Foundation. And it was created, and it invented the Christmas seal, where you just put a seal on an envelope, and send it out. And you know how many millions and millions and millions that's raised for medical cure. So those two, one may be more publicized than the other, but at different periods in time. Now, you have to take a long view on it. So I just wanted to point out that those organic connections are real.
John, I assume you join in the celebration of the disappearance of donor intent early on. Is that?
I was going to offer to make a comment related to that.
I should before you do that. Really, and Professor Lagerman got to this as well. The treatment of the legal cases around legacies and the transformation of that, and the transformation of tax policy as well. It's quite right that it's a story that finally I understand and I finally get. I'm not sure it's accurate, but it's that's simply my ignorance in terms of its readability and its strength as a narrative of a complicated and frankly.
It better be accurate because I spent a lot of time on it.
I'm sure it is accurate. But anyway, Jim.
And I think that the question of donor intent, which is often tied to the question of perpetuity or limited term, but I think the question of donor intent is an important one. I think that there are donors who either set up their foundations or otherwise give contributions to organizations with some expectation of how the funds will be used, and that they will be used consistent with that intent. Now, sometimes, as you in several places in your book, I think, wonderfully point out, sometimes the intent is for the benefit of humankind, in which case the donor intent is to rely explicitly, clearly, and in all ways on the trustees and subsequent trustees to make those decisions. Sometimes the legal documents might say one thing, and the behavior, the action, the activity might say something else. So then you get questions about, okay, well, what is the donor intent? You talk about Henry Ford, too, resigning from the Ford Foundation because the Ford Foundation, I think you quote from his letter that it was undermining capitalism, which gave rise to the foundation, and therefore was inconsistent with donor intent. But there wasn't anything legally he could do about it. I suspect that some of the evolution of the Pew Trust would have made J. Howard Pew upset. Yeah. But at some point, some of what we have to figure out is do we value donor intent enough to respect it for its purposes, in order to encourage the contributions that to these organizations.
I mean, the president of Princeton spent at least 3 years of his life trying to keep the money for the Woodrow Wilson School when the family moved it out because of those fellowships that had been used differently. So there is certainly a very old tradition of donor intent, and it can still be enforced. It can still be enforced. But the judges very often, it's either the judges in court by using Cypress or the trustees have had their say too. So it certainly has been, I think, on balance, donor intent has been often only partly maintained, sometimes in a symbolic way, sometimes in a more systematic way. But on balance, the money after a few generations becomes obsolete all by itself anyway. I mean, the purpose becomes obsolete by itself. That was a point that Julius Rosenwald made very eloquently early in the century. Yeah.
Okay, Martin. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, this. I'm sorry. Right here first.
Yes, hello. My name is Mary Lysenko, and I'm a independent researcher and observer. I've been in Washington the last 3 years, and this is a very, very interesting topic because I'm kind of very interested in it too. And you know, there's two other books here that I'm just like my question to Professor Olivier is The Myths and Realities of Philanthrocapitalism. Michael Edwards, your work. And How Public is Private Philanthropy. Now, of these three books, now does the professor address what the two gentlemen wrote in these two works? And do any of the three of you writing on philanthropy, and we've heard a wonderful discussion here, do you address any of the statistics, the financial wealth of all these different organizations, foundations, and charities? And how true is, you know, the reports that I've been reading about the 600 trillion in derivatives? Now, and one of my questions actually on my little Twitter account, Listen to Mary with a number 2, I do ask who exactly holds these 600 trillion? Like, where are they concentrated? Would it be within all these philanthropies? Because they do have huge amounts of endowments and trusts and investments. As a matter of fact, I even have a little account with GM there on that reorganization, and I find an investment trust with 2 trillion. Meanwhile, they're, you know, not paying me my $5,000 little dollar bond. So yeah, that's my question. Do you address any of these financial aspects, and what effect does it have on the whole financial system and the meltdown that we've had? My suspicion is that it's part of the problem, and you know, participation. If you don't think participation, what's the problem? How do you address it? Well, with very strict accountability. And with all these different groups, think tanks that are studying, you included, why aren't people looking at, you know, the aspect of accountability and how to bring it into the laws?
Okay,
I mean, corporations, they're all corporations, they're all philanthropic, you know, and they're supposed to be answering. And I'm interested, and I can't get in. And, you know, I was at the Cato Institute, and I looked at their financials, and they're very limited in what they're telling you and where their money comes from, and what are they doing with it, and how much are they paying salaries, and so on and so forth.
Good.
So participation, you know, is possible.
Yeah,
it's not that difficult.
We've
got to be informed about how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Great. Thank you. Okay. Good. And why don't we actually? We only have 2 minutes, so why don't you, if you can do so, answer that question and make final comments on the panel for the day. Anyone, or just final comments, whichever you prefer to do.
Olivier, you should go last. Let's start from this end.
Okay. You know, I would reiterate that I appreciate this book. I mean, I offered criticisms. I appreciate that they were well received and well commented on. I think it is a very good book. It's a very easy book to read. There is a lot to learn from it, you know, and when the second edition fills the gaps, it will be even better.
Well, I had to say, as an author, my book answers all of your questions, much better than any of the other books that you might have on the reading list. So that's my answer to the first one. You know, parting thought is really accountability is the answer to concentrated power and influence, as far as we know. And so we should spend as much time as we possibly can, which we haven't really done today for other reasons, in thinking through what a better system of accountability would mean in philanthropy, particularly in big money philanthropy, because that's a particular accountability problem. You know, John and others have done lots of work on this, and we're getting better. But I don't think anyone can put their hand on the heart and say big philanthropy, maybe small and family philanthropy too, is anywhere near resolving the accountability question, which is key to answering a lot of what we put on the table today.
And Professor, Mr. Edwards' book really does tackle a lot of these questions. It really is a terrific book, I must say. I think we did a panel on that, did we not here? Yes, of course we did. Yes.
When I wrote my last book on philanthropy, derivatives didn't exist, so I do not address it. But I think the accountability point is very important, and it connects to something that Olivier and Bill and I were talking about before this panel, and that is the dearth of good critical writing about philanthropy, which this is an excellent, excellent example. And Olivier was saying his best hope is that this is quickly superseded. It is a puzzle to many people, certainly to me and I think to Olivier, that there has not been more good critical writing about foundations. There was a time when it was very difficult to get into the papers of foundations, but by and large that is not the case anymore. I mean, there are exceptions. So the more there can be conversations like this, the more then there can be writing of various kinds, not just full multi-year historical studies, but many studies. That's a very important form of accountability, and it's necessary.
Yeah. Last comment.
Well, first of all, again, I want to reiterate my appreciation for these comments. They were clever, thoughtful, tough, but also the praise was genuine, and so I appreciated the combination. And the hope that I have is that many of these questions will be answered by people doing research in the next 10 years or so. If that happens, there are a number of books in history that are written that are synthesis somehow prior to the monographic work, and this is pretty much what that is. You're dealing here, and this is why you came, with a topic that's really at the very heart of the American experience. And this is why we've had such an animated discussion. Much of the, perhaps the best comment that I had was on how easy the book is to read, because it was not easy to write. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you all for a terrific conversation.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Nice.
You too. You too. Thank you very much.